And with that, I will hand it over to our Deputy County Manager, Jimmy Giese.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar on the Cobb County ARPA application public submission process. My name is Jimmy Giese, and I'm the Deputy County Manager for Cobb County Government. One of the roles of my position with the county is to oversee capital spending programs such as this. We're excited for the launch of this application and look forward to sharing more today about how to apply for these American Rescue Plan Act recovery funds. The county has worked to design a public application process that leverages your creativity and expertise to identify projects that will meet the community's needs. Again, thank you to each one of you for taking the time to be here and bringing your questions about the application to the call. We look forward to seeing your submissions over the next few months. With that, I'll pass it off to Stephanie Chang with Deloitte, who is supporting us with this process. She'll walk you through a brief presentation on the application, and then we'll take questions that you may have. Stephanie?
All right, thanks, Jimmy, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We can just go forward to the next slide. As Jimmy noted, we'll spend some time this evening going over the application, a little bit around just the context of the ARPA, so American Rescue Plan Act, State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is where this funding comes from. A little bit just of an overview of that funding source and how it applies to Cobb specifically, and then where Cobb's investment priorities are, which really sets up kind of the structure and the focus for this application. I'll talk through the contents of the application and also give you a little bit more information about how these applications will be evaluated and what the steps are after you submit. And we anticipate that will take about half the time that we have. And then with the second half, we'll answer your questions. And a couple folks have already submitted questions to the arpa@cobbcounty.org email box. And then as Sarah noted at the top of the call, if you just put your questions into the Q&A, those will just get queued up for me, and we'll just answer those as they come in. Right, so let's step forward for a little bit of context. So through the U.S. American Rescue Plan Act, Treasury is overseeing a pot of funding called the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So the objective of this funding is to support the recovery from the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's to support the negative public health and economic impacts resulting from the pandemic. Of the billions of funds that were available to this, they were granted directly to states and to local governments. And so Cobb County, as you'll see, has received $147 million of this funding. The funding that's available as part of this public application process, it's about $108 million of that total $147 million. On the county's ARPA website, you can find more information about how that breaks down. There's a little bit that's held for contingency. There's a little bit that the county has already spent. And there's $108 million that the board has defined into priority areas and approved for this application process. So this application will be open to the public, or is currently open to the public. And you'll see that the application, it's structured to be in line with both ARPA goals and requirements, as well as county priorities that have been defined, essentially sort of a subset of what ARPA generally allows. The application is already open right now, and you're welcome to submit your applications between now and September 9th. That's when the application will close. The applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis as they're received. And come September 9th, if there is still funding that hasn't been allocated by this date, then the Board of Commissioners will collectively determine how they want to move forward from there. All right. So we can go for the next slide. These are Cobb County's investment priorities. And so there's an extensive process through the fall, through the spring, fall, winter, and spring, where there was a community needs survey that was opened in November. There were a lot of meetings, focus groups, one-on-one conversations with different community leaders from a variety of sectors around the county. And all of these inputs were brought together and analyzed and distilled into these 5 priority areas and 20 subtopics, which were ultimately approved by the board in April. So the 5 broad priority areas you can see are those black headers: community health, support services, economic development, county infrastructure, and public safety. And all of the subtopics that are identified underneath those are areas that are open for this public application. There are a couple of subtopics that are grayed out. You'll see down under county infrastructure and public safety. And these are open only for county agencies to apply for. The rationale there being simply that based on what ARPA defines as eligible expenses underneath these areas, they're a little bit more in line with sort of county, as the subtopic is named, county infrastructure level projects and programs, rather than more community organization. But all of the colored subtopics, those are open for your applications. In the very beginning of the application, which you can find on the county's website, there's a brief description of each priority area and each subtopic. And if you have any questions on this any further, feel free to send us an email at arpa@cobbcounty.org, and we can help you out to just better understand what's within the scope of these areas. Okay, let's go to the next question, next slide. All right, so just to give a quick overview of the application, I want to cover some of the criteria and also the application instructions. So you can see on the left side, the intent of this funding, it went directly to Cobb County, and that's because it's supposed to serve Cobb County residents and the needs that Cobb County residents have as a result of the pandemic. So you'll see that there's a question in the application that simply asks, is this targeted at Cobb County? The application also has to align with at least one of the 5 priority areas and at least one of the subtopics. This is because what the board has approved is a pot of funding. So taking, as I said, of the $147 million that Cobb has received, there have been amounts allocated to each of the subtopics and to each of the priority areas. And so we need to understand where your project aligns against those topics. And there's a question in the application where you can simply check off where your alignment is. Also, part of the guidelines that come from ARPA, the funding should support communities that are impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. There are a lot of different ways to describe and to explain how community have been impacted or disproportionately impacted. You'll see that in the application, there's a couple of predefined examples, which you're welcome to check off if those are applicable. If those are not applicable to who you're trying to target with your project, that's totally fine as well. There is a space for you to then detail just how the community that you're trying to serve with your project has been impacted by the pandemic. That's a requirement from Treasury, again, in line with the whole intent of this pot of funding, which is to support the recovery from the pandemic. Also, the Treasury guidelines ask that you consider equity in your project plans. They define equity within the guidance, and they're looking at how have some communities been traditionally maybe disadvantaged and perhaps as a result, suffered some disproportionate impacts of the pandemic. So there's a little bit of guidance in the application and also links to where you can find out more information about that. And I just want to note this application isn't for individual household or business level direct grants. It's for more program levels. So if you want to set up a program that would assist multiple households or multiple businesses, that's more the scope that this application is looking for. On the right side, you can see what the application instructions are at a very high level. So please do complete all of the fields. If your application is incomplete, we may not be able to fully evaluate it. And so please do try and complete all the fields. Include as much detail as possible. We do allow for you to provide additional supporting documents. There's text boxes that are open for you to provide information about your project plan, your budget, your timeline, etc. But we understand that many of you may have more detailed plans and thinking around what you're proposing to do. So please do include those materials. You can do that as attachments alongside the relevant questions. Please provide your contact information. This is so the county can follow up with you as needed. You will receive a confirmation once your application is submitted. Upon initial review of the application, if there's some additional information that may be needed or some clarification, the county would use this information to follow up. And so if we can't get in touch with you, it would be hard for us to continue to evaluate your application. And then finally, once your application goes through the evaluation process, if it either is recommended to go before the board or not, we would be able to contact you with this information. And then finally, I do want to just note this last bullet. So the application is open to individuals and to organizations. Organizations more likely to have the capacity to implement the projects directly themselves, just having organizational capacity to do so. Those applications will be prioritized somewhat, just recognizing the limited capacity that may exist for ideas. They're wonderful ideas, to just find an organization that can help to implement them. So we will still be reviewing and looking at these ideas that aren't associated with an organization. And in cases where the idea is particularly strong, maybe trying to find some implementation capacity, but there will be some priority given to applications that demonstrate that capacity to execute the projects. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. So now I'd like to step through the sections of the application itself. There's an introduction and 4 sections. In the introduction, so there's some light context along the lines of what I covered around the background of the ARPA funding, what Cobb County has prioritized as part of that. There's brief descriptions of the subtopics and priority areas, also the allocation amounts. So while there's no minimum and maximum that you can apply for, the amounts that have been approved in line with each of those subtopics is specified in the introduction. The submission criteria and instructions, which I just reviewed, are part of the introduction. And there's also an overview of the evaluation criteria. And I'll review the evaluation criteria a little bit later in this webinar after we cover the contents of the application itself. Go to the next slide. I'll talk about section 1. We just go back to section 1. Yeah. So here we're looking for kind of general project and applicant information, kind of an overview. Your project's name, contact info, and then pretty high level project information. So what's the amount of funding that you're requesting? What's are you applying as an organization? Are you applying as an individual? And if you're an organization, there will be some additional information that's collected just to understand a little bit more about the organization. There will also be a question here around where your proposed project aligns with the county's priority areas. And then here you'll also provide a brief summary of your project. We're just looking for something around 50 to 250 words, so kind of brief overview. Okay, we can go forward to the next section. So in the second section here, we'll get into more of the project details. We'll be looking for a description of the project scope. And by scope, we mean just what's the set of activities that your project plans to undertake as part of what's being proposed. We're looking for a timeline so that we can understand how these project activities will be executed over the life of the project. With ARPA funding, just a date to keep in mind, these funds must be expended by December 31, 2026. So this isn't intended to be long-term funding. It really is meant to be focused on the more acute recovery from the effects of the pandemic. We're also looking here for a budget of the project expenses. We're looking for a line item breakout, and this is one of the items where as noted before, there's an opportunity to upload additional documents if needed, just so you can provide that additional level of detail. Here we'll also ask if you have other funding that's going to be used in conjunction with the requested ARPA funding. We recognize that many organizations may already have programs underway that align well with the county's priority areas or with the subtopics. And so you may be looking to augment what you're doing or augment the funding that you currently have. And so here you can just provide a little bit of information about what funding you currently have, what additional funding you're looking for, and what that additional funding would go to. And also I wanted to note, can we please go back to the, yep. Here we'll also ask if there's any potential ongoing costs. As I just noted, ARPA is one-time funding. And so if the project would create ongoing costs, have ongoing maintenance, the county would just want to be aware of that, just to understand the financial implications of the project. And finally, here we'll also ask about potential risks. So it's not a bad thing for the project to have risks. We recognize that all projects do. But what we're looking for here is a sense of how you've considered the practical implications of your project and what you're proposing, and just what planning or consideration you've done to reasonably manage those risks where possible. Okay, we'll go to section 3. So here's where we start to look at who you're looking to target and who would be standing to benefit from the work that you're proposing, and also as noted as part of ARPA's guidance, just how you're taking equity into consideration. So as I said before, equity is a focus of the ARPA legislation, and that comes from a recognition that the pandemic has affected our communities in different ways, and it may have affected some communities more than others. And so communities that may be traditionally underserved in some ways, such as certain populations in certain geographies, certain income levels, certain ethnic groups, these communities may have experienced a different or a disproportionate impact from the pandemic. So in the section on equity, we'll be asking here some questions, just how you've considered this in your program design. And then I want to note that in question, I think 3.3 in this section, we define impacted and disproportionately impacted communities. This is, as I said before, ARPA's looking to benefit communities that have been impacted or disproportionately, so sort of particularly impacted. And they've provided a couple of predefined groups, but who's eligible for this funding is not limited to those predefined groups. So if your project doesn't support one of these groups, but you do have a community in mind that is impacted by the pandemic, you have the opportunity to describe here how they've been impacted. And then here we'll start to lightly touch on just what is the anticipated impact that your project would have in the community. Let's step forward to the next slide, please. So in section 4, this is where we get a little bit deeper into the impact and the intended outcomes of your project. So here we're asking you to provide some of your thinking around what you are aiming to achieve through your project, and by performing the activities that are in your scope, right? That's one aspect of it, but then trying to understand and measure and report on what the outcomes are and the impact of your project is. That's another part of what the project entails. Here also, I just want to note, if you plan to work with other organizations, we know there's been some discussion about organizations working together to put together kind of multi-sectoral or multifaceted programming. If you plan to work with other organizations, here's where you can make a note of that explicitly and include mention of those other organizations. It is fine though in the previous sections when you're looking at the project scope and describing the activities, to add in detail there about who is responsible for what, just to help the county better understand what you're planning and how you envision implementing the project. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll start to talk about just after you submit your application, so after you pull together all that information, I do just want to make a note. So the application, it's available online. There's an online form you can fill out. You can't save the application, so we are looking you to enter all that information at one time. Recognize that's a lot to pull together. There is also now on the website a PDF version of the application. If you want to download that and take a look, just so you can first organize all of the information that's part of your submission and then get it uploaded into the online form. We do ask that you submit through the online form if possible. It will streamline just the assessment and evaluation of the form a little bit. If for whatever reason you're not able to access the online form and you need to submit via the PDF, whether printing that out, providing it in hard copy, the information for how you can do that is included in the PDF itself. Simply post it to the county office, and that information is all included in that document. Okay, so continuing forward to how the application will be evaluated and just what happens after you submit it. The first step is a review, and this is simply a review for, is the application complete? Is there anything that we need, any gaps that we need to fill in or any clarification that's needed? And then we'll also look at it through the lens of ARPA eligibility. So does it fall within the guidelines of what is permissible, what's considered an eligible expense under ARPA? We'll also look at how does it align with the county's priorities and the county's subtopics, which are a subset of the pool of ARPA eligibility. Next, the county will evaluate the applications. So evaluation is based on a set of criteria. It's a standard set of criteria, which I'll detail next. And based on this evaluation, a subset of applications will be recommended to the board. And so the final step in the process would be approval. So if your project application makes it through the review and the evaluation, it's going to be recommended to the board. Then as a formal agenda item in the board's biweekly meetings, they would have the opportunity to review these recommended applications. And ultimately, it's up to the Board of Commissioners to vote and approve or hold or send back for more review. But that decision of who to fund ultimately rests with the Board of Commissioners. We can go forward to the next slide. So here we have the set of criteria that comprise the evaluation. So the first couple of criteria around equity, financial continuity, and impact, these are all around what is the impact or the benefits of the project going to be. So equity comes from ARPA and what's specified in the guidance. Financial continuity is just a consideration of will there be additional financial needs created beyond the life of the ARPA funding. Impact will be looking at the KPIs that are specified in section 4 of the application and just how the benefits, the proposed benefits to the county's residents, just how those are described, how those are commensurate with the overall cost and activities of the project. Leverage, this is looking at where, if applicable, where the ARPA funding will help to accelerate or expand upon the other sources of funding. So this relates to that question of, if your organization has funding and already has some programs that are in line with the priority areas and the subtopics, if you already have those kinds of programs in flight, how will the addition of these ARPA dollars augment or help to scale up the impact that you're able to have. Risk mitigation, project budget, and project plan. These are all looking at the project planning. So details around your own risk assessment, the level of detail in the budget and how you've broken that out. Does that make sense vis-a-vis the project plan and what you're proposing to do? Are the costs reasonable? Are the costs realistic? And what's the kind of the benefit that you're projecting based on what you're budgeting? Project plan is the details of the scope, et cetera. KPI is another kind of way to describe the impact that your project is looking to have. And so KPIs, there's a section in section 4, a question in section 4 where we're asking you to describe kind of what's the metric and then what's the target numbers that you're trying to achieve, just so that we get a sense of, for the budget that you're requesting and what you're proposing to do, what's the proposed kind of key indicators that we'll be looking for. Okay, let's go forward. Just want to review a couple of key dates to keep in mind as far as the application goes. So the application has been open for a couple of weeks now. It opened on June 6th, and it will remain open for about 3 months in total. So on September 9th, 5 p.m., that's when the application will close. You're welcome to submit your application anytime between now and September 9th. I think we had a question in the last webinar that we did if there was some incomplete information or if people wanted to update their proposals, and you can resubmit your application if you'd like. Particularly if there are a number of changes that you're looking to make, just make sure you use the same project name and same project contact information so that we know it's indeed for the same project, because we recognize some groups may be submitting multiple proposals and those would have different project names. So we won't replace one with another. The review of these applications, as we said, will be on a rolling basis. And so this will happen throughout this 3-month period. The county is currently just waiting for a few more applications to come in, and then we'll start the review and the evaluation process. We anticipate that in the fall, all the final recommendations would be received by the Board of Commissioners. They may begin approving projects between now and September 9th, but then in the fall, that's when we would certainly be looking for the board to finish their review of all the final recommendations. Applicants will be notified of the review and the next steps. So as I said, after you submit your application, you'd receive confirmation that it's been received. If there's any clarification that we need, the county will reach out to you for that. And then before recommended projects go to the board, at that time, if your application will be recommended, then the county would be in touch with you for a final review and conversation, just to make sure that the details that are put forth to the board are indeed accurate. You can see down at the bottom here, and this information is also available on the county's website. There's a link with more of the background information, the FAQs for the application. That's cobbcounty.org/ARPA. Or you can send an email with any question that you have on this process or the application to arpa@cobbcounty.org. And just a little bit more information about the next steps. This is based, again, on some additional questions that we got from the last webinar. There are some questions around how the funding would actually be dispersed. So if your application is recommended, goes before the board and is approved, how would you actually receive those funds? In general, with federal funding, reimbursement is the preferred approach. And so that would be the case here as well. However, we do recognize that there may be cases where it's not feasible for organizations to front all the funding for what they're proposing to do. And so on a case-by-case basis, the county will consider where advance payments make sense. As part of this process, all organizations will be categorized as either a subrecipient, contractor, or a beneficiary. These are federal categorizations, and there's different requirements that apply to the different categories. For beneficiaries and subrecipients, these two categories are eligible for advance payments. So you can see how that would play into the county's analysis of where advance funding would make sense. Some of the factors that would be taken into consideration for where advance payments make sense and is feasible, it would be looking at what you're proposing to do. You look at what the budget is of what you're proposing to do, a little bit about the financial situation of your organization, any organizational history you have managing similar kinds of funding, and then also looking at, in your project planning, can the funding be broken up into payments or into disbursements? So it wouldn't necessarily be all the funding up front. It might be a defined portion of the funding that would allow you to begin the work and complete a defined subset of the activities that you've proposed. And once you complete those activities and turn in your required expense records and the other documentation, then maybe the next payment would be issued. So you can see how it's a little bit case by case, and that would be part of the conversation. If your application will be recommended to go before the board for approval, the county would want to just have that conversation, get on the same page with you to make sure that what's being proposed is indeed feasible for the organization before it goes for final approval. From the monitoring and reporting side of things, depending on how you're categorized as a beneficiary, a subrecipient, or a contractor, there's different monitoring and reporting requirements. In general, the requirements vary based on the size of the grant amount. The requirements also vary depending on the type of project that you're looking to do. We've included 2 links at the bottom here, and these materials will be shared on the website, which show where these requirements are coming from. So one is from the Uniform Federal Guidance 2 CFR 200, which guides a lot of how this kind of grant funding works and should be monitored and how it should be reported. And then there's also guidance from Treasury specific to this fund, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, and that's linked down below as well. Based on the project type, so for example, if you're proposing to do a project around digital equity and it's expanding access to broadband, there may be certain reporting requirements, certain kinds of metrics that Treasury will be looking for you to report on, versus if you're doing an evidence-based mental health project, there's going to be some different kind of metrics that Treasury will be looking on based on what that project area is. So if you have more questions on that, feel free to send us a note at arpa@cobbcounty.org, or check out those 2 links at the bottom there, just to get a sense of kind of the range of what the requirements could be. Let's go forward to the next slide. All right, so we'll start with some Q&A. We do have a couple of questions that I just want to recap on the next slide just before we get started. So first, how are applications submitted? Again, there's an online application at cobbcounty.org/ARPA. You can find the link there. And if you'd like, you can email arpa@cobbcounty.org to get the PDF application, which can be submitted on paper. Then when's the application deadline? All applications must be submitted by September 9th, 5 p.m. Can I submit a project idea? Yes, you can submit an idea without having an affiliation with an organization. Just answer the questions appropriately. There's some questions, are you an organization? You would mark no. Is there a minimum or maximum amount of funding that can be requested? So there's no minimum amount. And then depending on the subtopics that your project is aligned to, there's an approved allocated amount, which would essentially be like your maximum. And you can find all of that in FAQs. You can find it at the very top of the application, All of those allocations are specified there. Can I collaborate with other organizations? Yes, and this is encouraged. We recognize that many of the challenges and the subtopics that are identified and indeed exacerbated by COVID, have interdependencies with other subtopics. So you can indeed work with other organizations to submit an application. If this is the case, please just make it clear, the organization that's submitting the application is essentially like the lead organization. You only need to submit one application for that collaborative project. And then in the application itself, detail which other organizations are involved and how the scope would divide across those organizations. And then how will I be notified once funding decisions have been made? This is why the application asks for contact information. As I said, you'll receive confirmation that your application has been received, as well as notification if it's being recommended and moving forward in the process. So you can click through. We just have summary answers to pop up here on these other items. And then we can now shift over to Q&A and the questions that we've received in our little Q&A box here. So let me see. The first question, we had a couple that were submitted in advance to our ARPA at Cobb County box. And so we'll just go through those quickly and continue on with what we're seeing in the Q&A here. The first question is around the scoring criteria. So we present the scoring criteria, but the weighting of the criteria are not specified. So each of the criteria will be weighted equally and applied consistently. So there's no, particular weighting of one criteria over another. The next question is on attaching supporting documentation for the question around showing that your organization's leadership approves. And for this, they're asking, it's asked, will one letter from our board chair or a board member suffice? Would multiple letters be more helpful towards our point total? So multiple letters would not be needed. What we're just looking for here is, it could be your board chair, a board member, just whoever has the authority to approve the use of the organization's resources for this project. As long as the letters coming from them, then that would satisfy this requirement. A question around, in what Cobb County district is your organization located? And for this, is it acceptable? Is there any penalty or difference in how it will be evaluated if the main organization office is outside of Cobb County? So here, you won't be penalized if your organization is not based in Cobb. Just answer this question, yeah, just based on where your organization is located. I think there's another question for where you're targeting the impacts of your project. So in that question, just explain what communities you're looking to serve that are within Cobb, and that takes care of that one. When there's a question around the subtopic alignment, and if you get extra points, if you check multiple subtopics that apply to your project, there's no extra points. However, select the subtopics that are most applicable and that are relevant to your project. This is for both the funding allocation purposes, because we need to understand what funding we're drawing against when we're looking at these applications, and then also for reporting purposes, right? Depending on the area, what topics of your projects, then that would inform what the reporting requirements ultimately end up being. Okay, next. Are there word counts or character counts if they're not stated? No, there's no caps that we've set. Maybe in the online form, there might be some limits that we run into. So we haven't specified those. Please just try and present concise where possible, but we do want to allow for detail where you feel it's appropriate to. to share that and where you feel it would help the county to better understand what you're proposing to do. Can you please clarify what subaward and award mean in the application? For example, in question 2.4, can you clarify what up to the first 25,000 of each subaward means? So in this context, award is what Cobb County has received. So Cobb County was awarded $147 million from Treasury. Subaward is when Cobb County would then grant that to another entity. So as an applicant, you would be receiving a subaward. So that's what we mean by subaward. Subaward is the amount that would be applicable to you as an applicant. The next question, can you please offer some examples of the types of risks that you're talking about? So here we're looking at any factors that could affect the delivery of your project. Anything that could affect the budget, could affect the timeline, or could affect the impacts that your project is trying to have. So for example, any anticipated or potential risks such as supply chain issues, labor or staffing issues, any potential challenges or potential risks around getting the requisite participation in your projects. We know that sometimes that can be a challenge. And again, having these challenges, having these risks is not a bad thing. Just want to get a sense that you've thought through just the practicalities of implementation here. Okay, the next question is around attachments. The application notes that applications should include as much detail as possible. Are attachments required? What are the word or character count limits or any format types for the text of attachments? And how much do attachments matter for the evaluation of applications? So we are looking, as far as which attachments are required, we're looking for attachments for the timeline and the budget. This is just because we recognize that a text box is not really the typical format for a timeline or a budget. If, in addition to these, timeline and budget, if you note that you receive other federal funds, or if your project will create ongoing operating costs, then we would also be looking for attachments to those as well. There are no word or character count limits, and there's no specified format for the attachments. And this is just recognizing that we may have a lot of different organizations with different access to tools and maybe not standard software across the board. So we do want to allow for that. So there's no specified types there. And then as far as which attachments matter for our point total, so required attachments must be provided. And then where really it's just, if you think about from whoever will be looking at and evaluating your project, just to help them really understand what is it that you're trying to do in your project plan, in the budget, in the timeline, where can you provide sufficient detail for that? That's what I would use as my guidance in approaching the attachments. Okay. How many applications have been submitted so far, and how many have been processed and approved so far? So we've received about 15 applications so far. And I just want to note, we recognize that submissions will not be kind of a steady trajectory going up. I think people need a little bit of time to just review and absorb the application, understand what it's asking for. And we anticipate that there may be a little bit of a bump in application submissions just as a little more time goes on, and it's really before the deadline. All of the submitted applications have gone through that initial review just for completeness, just for ARPA eligibility. They have not gone through evaluation yet. Evaluation is where we would be looking at the criteria. So we're just waiting to build up a little bit more of a critical mass of those applications before we begin the evaluation process. Is there any update on the alternative to priority 4.2 on stormwater? So I think this question is around why is this one restricted to county applications only? And the reason is because the application, the way that ARPA specifies what's eligible under this subtopic, it's really around kind of describing government level services, government level stormwater infrastructure, rather than household level. And so that's why we've put this in the county agency, just because the county water department, would have responsibility for that infrastructure at more of like a government level. If there are people who are interested in applying as individual households, we would encourage you to reach out, and you can submit an idea as an individual. If there's some common theme in there, it might be something that could be entertained as a project, right? So individual households are not eligible, but a program that could benefit multiple, that could be considered. But just want to caveat that what the ARPA guidance is looking for is more kind of county infrastructure level rather than household. Okay, next question. Can we see examples of other submissions that have been approved? So no applications have been approved yet at this time. Nothing's gone before the board. As I said before, applications that have been submitted so far have been reviewed, but have not yet gone through the evaluation stage, and they need to go through evaluation before they can be recommended to the board for approval. If we want to apply for several priority areas, do we submit one application for all the priorities or separate ones for each? So this depends on how your project aligns with the priority areas. If there's a couple of discrete projects, then I would say submit those as separate applications. If there is a project where, for example, it's a mental health and substance abuse and homelessness project where those things kind of all, those issues all intersect, and you're trying to provide holistic services of some kind, then that would be a case where it would be appropriate to submit one application that covers multiple subtopics. Next question, we saw applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis. Will the county be making funding decisions or only reviewing applications? I'm concerned that people who apply first may have the advantage in getting the money first. So yes, that is a possibility. Overall, I think the county is really looking to prioritize quality applications. That's why, the applications that have been received so far, the county has done review, but is waiting a little bit to do the evaluation. So it will take a little bit of time for all the applications to be reviewed, to develop sets of recommended projects that can then go to the board. So I'd say just keep that in mind, that review is rolling, approval may be rolling, but also that applications probably, I can tell you right now, applications are not coming in. There was not a surge right when we opened the application. We've received a lot of questions. It seems like organizations in the community trying to take the time to understand what the application is looking for, explore opportunities where it makes sense to work together, and the county will take that into consideration as it's doing its evaluation and putting forth recommendations. Who exactly reviews and evaluates the applications before the board decides? So the initial review is being done by Deloitte in conjunction with the county. This is because from the ARPA eligibility perspective, we're helping to look at, are these applications just complete from a content perspective, and do they align to an eligible expenditure category? Because this funding can't go towards projects that would not be considered ARPA eligible under the Treasury guidance. Then the county is doing the review, doing the evaluation of the applications, and there will be groups from within the county that are doing the evaluations with relevant subject matter expertise in the priority areas and putting forth the recommendations. Let's see. The next question is, what's the size range of the grants and is there a minimum amount? So no minimum amount. As far as size range, we didn't specify here. Just recognizing there may be a range of organizational profiles that apply for this funding. So the capacity to absorb that funding may vary as well. Could be smaller organizations that are, very well embedded within or have relationships with certain impacted communities that would like to do a smaller scale project, but very worthwhile still. And maybe larger, more established organizations that want to do larger scale projects, and that's fine as well. I would say look at the allocated amounts, the approved allocations in line with each of the subtopics to get a sense of what's available. So just for example, just looking at some of the approved allocations. So for workforce development, for example, 12.3 million has been approved towards workforce development. We have mental health, 12.1 million. Those are some of the larger pots. Affordable housing, 13.8 million. And then in some of the more modest allocations, food security, 2.2 million, or substance abuse, 3.6 million. All of these allocations can be found in the FAQs, and also they can be found just in that upfront introduction to the application itself. If I'm a brick and mortar business wanting to submit a project, do I submit as an individual or as an organization? So it depends a little bit on the nature of what you're proposing. If it's an idea that is meant to serve your business directly and only your business, that would be as an individual. And again, the intent of this application is not to provide household and individual business level grants. If it's to provide, to essentially create a program serving multiple households or multiple businesses, then it applies an organization. Is there a limit to the size of the grant? Have just talked about that with a minimum and maximum. So again, please refer to the approved allocations in the FAQs in the upfront introduction section of the application for that guidance. Can we submit more than one project? Yes, you can. Just make sure those project names are different and that in the description of the project summary and the project scope, that it's clearly distinct, right? What these different projects are aiming to do. Can faith-based organizations or faith organizations in the community get funds? Yes, faith-based organizations may receive funds. The criteria here would be the same as for everybody else, which is the project that you're applying for, does it meet the ARPA eligibility? Does it align with the county priority areas and subtopics? And then based on the quality and the content of the application contents itself, how do you score in the evaluation against those criteria that I described? And then would your project make it through to recommendation? So yes, you're eligible to apply. If organizations wanted to collaborate for proposals, will Deloitte be available to answer questions or provide guidance until 2026? So at this point in time, so Deloitte is contracted to support the program through the fall of this year. And just depending on what the county chooses to do, the county may choose to extend or seek other support or manage this on their own. The ARPA at cobbcounty.org email address will remain regardless of whether Deloitte is behind it or not. And so you can submit your questions there. during the time when we are engaged with the county, of course, we'd be happy to work with you to answer any questions or provide guidance that we can. Let's see. Can you give an example of a dollar amount that meets the threshold for monitoring? So it's a little hard for me to just give a specific dollar amount. I mean, all of the funding that's granted out, the county does need to provide some amount of reporting or documentation for back to Treasury. But then the kind of the level of detail and the rigor there, that's defined a little bit by the scale of the project and the scale of the overall budget and based on the type of work you're proposing to do. But for all of the funding, there will be some reporting, and you will be asked to provide evidence or documentation of what your expenses have been. Even if it's a small grant, it wouldn't just be, here's the check, goodbye. It would be, here's the funding, here's the basic requirements that you need to fulfill, and here's the timeline in which to do it, which would be in line with what you're proposing. The criteria for scoring are listed, but percentages are not. So all the criteria will be scored, will be weighted equally. What's the requirements to be considered an organization? So an organization could be a nonprofit, a government organization, government agency like a county agency, educational organization or institution. Basically, if there is some sort of group or affiliation that you have, we're just looking for the distinction between an individual versus someone applying as part of an organized entity of some kind. And if you have a little bit more specifics that you can share on just what you're looking at and what you may be trying to reason through, you can email ARPA@cobbcounty.org, and we can take a closer look at your specific situation. Are county agencies allowed to apply for the categories designated for public agencies? Yes, county agencies can apply to any of the 5 categories, recognizing that the different county agencies have different remits and missions that kind of span all of the different priority areas and subtopics. If the project requires 2 people and not an organization, should we apply as an individual? So if you're not affiliated with an organization, then you can apply as an individual. If you have maybe a little more detail or more specific questions there, you can email us at ARPA@cobbcounty.org. Let's see. Can you display a list of all questions and answers? So we'll update the FAQs with any additional questions that aren't currently covered in there. And if you have any other additional questions, please email us at ARPA@cobbcounty.org. Recognizing that we just have about a minute left in the webinar, just recognize that there will be a couple of questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. The options there, you can email us at ARPA@cobbcounty.org. And then let me see if there's some that are kind of unique here. If you encounter technical issues with the application when you're trying to submit, the best way to reach us is ARPA@cobbcounty.org. Do you need SAM registration to submit an application? No, you don't need SAM registration to submit an application. If your project application is approved, ultimately you will need to register in SAM, and SAM is the government, the federal system for subrecipients of this funding. Let's see. There's a couple of questions here that are kind of specific to certain ideas or project ideas it looks like you may have. Please go ahead and send those to us at ARPA@cobbcounty.org. We can give you a more tailored response that's specific to your situation. All right, I know that we're at time right now. Thank you again for your time, for joining us this evening. Thank you for your interest, for taking the time to put together your applications. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at arpa@cobbcounty.org. There is still a good runway open in the application period, and we'll be happy to answer any additional questions you have through that email at arpa@cobbcounty.org.